Hello and welcome back to Analysis. In the first half of the programme, we've been discussing the security situation in Iraq and the role of the United States. Now we'll be asking, can the government of Iraq regain control? And what role can Iran play after its offer to work with the US in Iraq? And will there be implications for the conflict in Syria as the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant continue to gather support? Rejoining me in the studio is Paul Schulte, who's visiting professor at King's College London, Sabhar al-Muktar, president of the Arab Lawyers Association, Zaid Al-Issa, who's a Middle East political analyst, and via Skype we're now joined by Collin Freeman, who's chief foreign correspondent of the Sunday Telegraph. Welcome back, everybody. Paul, you were saying that you thought that the Americans could only be in a limited sense engaged here. How limited? And do you think that Iran is now, is the fact that Iran is helping to facilitate this, is that going to be something which exacerbates the tensions in Iraq or helps?
Well, it's moved beyond American control. It was beyond American control even when they had tens of thousands of troops there, and now clearly there's very little they can do, and they're coming to terms with that. They'll assist technically as they can. They'll give they'll sell weapons, but as was pointed out, the weapons will not be decisive. It'll be the willingness of the Iraqi armed forces to go in and clear murderously dangerous city blocks that will make a difference. As for Iran, there is a view which says that they have played a devastatingly effective soft and covert power game, which has given them effective control of the Iraqi government. So, of course, they will do whatever they can do to keep that control, and they will appear to be looking for an inclusive settlement, but it's quite unlikely that they'll really want that. In any case, the al-Qaida, and there is an al-Qaida, it's doing car bombings every week in Baghdad as well as seizing places. Every day.
Now on a daily basis.
They will continue to make the situation difficult and make it very hard for Shiite politicians to go for settlements which seem politically inclusive with Sunni, and yet that's the only way ahead. So it will be agonizingly difficult both to prosecute the campaign in Anbar and to try and find a wider political settlement.
Let me bring Collin in. Collin, welcome to the programme. At what point do you think it ceases to be useful to talk about al-Qaeda as a terrorist organisation in circumstances where they may be getting wider support, or where indeed the people doing the fighting may not necessarily be linked to al-Qaeda but may have other political reasons for engaging in the conflict?
Well, you're absolutely right. It's always a murky situation in places like Anbar. And from the people I've been speaking to in the last few days, it does seem that the notion that al-Qaeda has actually taken over Fallujah is perhaps a little bit exaggerated. What I've been told is that a convoy of maybe 15 or 16 vehicles turned up in Fallujah in the last few days, and that was kind of, with the support of some people described as kind of sleeper supporters in the city. But that is perhaps somewhat different from what we remember from, say, 8 or 9 years ago, when there was a perception that they enjoyed quite widespread support in somewhere like Fallujah, and even then, that's perhaps overstating it. Therefore, it's perhaps exaggerating it to say that the whole of Fallujah wants them there. And I think that's also why we've seen so far the Iraqi army holding off from doing any major assault, because they're hoping that some of the local tribes who do not support al-Qaeda, and remember there's a long history of bad blood between them since the Sunni awakening of 2007. They're hoping that some of those tribes will be able to get these people out, and in fact there may be even some doubts as to whether they are still there.
Well, that's an interesting point, because I've heard some of those reports as well. So just let me press you a little bit on that, because one of the things that we were saying in the first part of the programme is that the kind of war on terror rhetoric that was begun by the Americans in the original invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan is now being played back to them by governments across the region, from Egypt to Syria, and now by the Iraqi government. So, if you were pushed, what would you say the actual kind of proportion of al-Qaeda influence in the revolt in Fallujah is? Or is that an impossible question to answer?
I mean, I'm not the person to ask. You need to ask someone in Fallujah for that. But my impression is that while they don't while not everybody there supports their idea of a jihadist caliphate and all this kind of thing, and no drinking and no smoking and brutal Sharia punishments, of sort of things that drove them out and ended up driving them out in the past. They are seen as a kind of vanguard to some extent for those Sunnis who feel that the new government in Baghdad, the Shia-dominated government, is not supporting them and is hostile to them. And there are certain people in Fallujah, as I've been told, that think ISIS, al-Qaida, whatever you call them, they're at least standing up for Sunni rights, and they're not, they don't want this Shia government or Persian Iranian government dominating them as they see it. So there is a certain crossover there which makes it difficult.
Okay, let me just put that point to Sabhar. So if we're trying to sort of look a little bit closer and a little bit more analytically at the forces involved, no doubt there are al-Qaeda forces involved, but is that the whole story?
No, it isn't. Certainly, there is you had a whole year of people were against the government. They had demands which were not met. There were no Qaeda, there was no talk of anything of that sort. When Maliki decided it's time to move against it, he immediately produced the card of al-Qaeda. Now, obviously, there are some elements within these cities who have allegiances or they are part of whatever movement. But you have the allegiance of convenience, if you like. If you're fighting Maliki, Maliki took the awakening, the Sahwa, the Sunnis. He used them, the Americans used them, and then he dumped them. So now they have their problem. The Sahwa itself, the awakening, had a hell of a war with the Qaeda, so they have vengeance between the two. But at the present moment, the situation, it is Maliki against all those people. Now, people are fighting for probably different agendas, but the idea that somehow Fallujah and Ramadi is all Qaeda and ISIL and what have you is really, it now doesn't hold water, even within Iraq. That's why you had the members of parliament left. That's why you have the ministers resign. That's why you have the Shia leaders like Muktar, like Ayad Allawi, like many of the leaders in the southern tribes are saying, no, you're not going to do that again. So it's actually, I don't think it is a Qaeda war. This is Maliki versus the people.
Okay. Zaid, we talked earlier about the effect of Syria on Iraq, but what do you think will be the likely effect of these developments in Iraq on Syria?
Well, I mean, first of all, there is an important point. The point is, if we look at those protest camps, they started at the beginning spontaneously, and then they were immediately taken over by politicians who are competing for influence and who haven't done anything like public services to the people. They jumped on the bandwagon, but al-Qaeda has been there. It has been documented. They appeared on the podiums. They had training camps inside. They had arms inside. And it is this violently antagonistic sectarian rhetoric which was hyped up and propped up, which has ramped up the sectarian strife.
And the effect of this on Syria, that was the question.
The effect on this on Syria, it is a dual thing. You see, it all started off by weapons, by arming, funding, logistical support, and also paying salaries to insurgents going to Syria in order to fight to Syria. The strategy was at the beginning to concentrate and focus on Syria. If the regime in Syria crumbles, then it will be easy to deal a mortal blow to the regime in Iraq. So all the funding, and that's documented by the New York Times, which says that this funding and arming went to the most radical extremist groups, which are like something like Jabhat al-Nusra. And we mustn't forget that Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the leader of al-Qaeda in Iraq, has acknowledged and said Jabhat al-Nusra is merely an extension of al-Qaeda in Iraq, and we always share all the resources. That means that the al-Qaeda in Iraq was propped up and bolstered by all that funding which went to Syria. Now we're seeing the reverse happening. The concentration and the focus is moving back to Iraq from Syria as al-Qaeda is facing rebellion from other groups.
Paul, do you think that you were saying, whatever happened in the past, the Americans don't control the situation now, but there's increasingly large parts of the Middle East where this is true, isn't it? I mean, they clearly don't control the process in Syria. They don't control what's happening in Iraq. I guess the influence of the Americans in Egypt is probably an all-time low. How do you think this is fitting into a bigger picture of the exercise of American power in the Middle East?
I think it goes further than that. It's not just about the Americans losing power over governments. What you're seeing in a number of places is that governments are losing power over their own regions and their own cities. And I mean, that's the kind of ugly scenario that can come out in Anbar and Syria, that you get a breaking down of state boundaries and the moving across of dangerous people, money, weapons, and an increase. And then, of course, within Syria, you have a complete breakdown of central control. I mean, whoever runs Syria, however that civil war comes out, there is not going to be a centralized, effective Syrian state anymore. And there may be a similar future for Iraq if this insurgency is allowed to, however you describe it, if it's allowed to succeed, that will mean the end of a centralized Iraqi state. So, and given the way that Egypt, although the army there is still in control, but the underlying tensions are building up, given the way that Egypt might go, it's a very ugly, chaotic future for a number of Middle Eastern countries, and the question of American power influence is ceasing to be an important one.
Collin, what do you think about that? Because I mean, there would be a very deep, if unpleasant, irony, wouldn't there, if this whole process was begun in the years of the sort of high tide of the war on terror, with a rhetoric which described these states as failed states, when actually they were just states that the Americans didn't like, but they end up being failed states.
Well, clearly, I don't think Washington is going to be looking at what's going on in Iraq in a very happy mood, a very happy fashion at the moment. My understanding is that they are now this mounting crisis with the Sunnis in Anbar and so on in the last year, and the growing profile of al-Qaida has sort of forced the Maliki government to go back to Washington and enter into greater cooperation with things like intelligence sharing and so on. And for example, the Maliki government, I don't think has, they don't have drones, they don't have any of the surveillance or eavesdropping equipment that they need to be able to try and hit al-Qaida. Most of these al-Qaida units are out in the desert areas where, the territory gives them the natural advantage over the Iraqi army. If the Iraqi army is equipped with the US-style technology, missiles and so on, which we have seen in use in Ramadi in the last few days, the argument is that if they're equipped with that sort of stuff, I've been told that may give them the upper hand that they need. Because a lot of these al-Qaida units, they are small outfits. You see them on videos going around in convoys of 15 or 20 vehicles. It looks terrifying, but actually they're out in the middle of the desert, and all they're doing is a sort of military equivalent of a flash mob. If they are hit by in the right fashion, that may deal them quite significant blows. Although it's a question of wait and see.
Okay, Sabhar, do you think this is where we're going now? Because I mean, as we've said before, this isn't the first kind of erosion of the territorial integrity of Iraq. The Kurdish area is now, to all intents and purposes, independent. Do you think this is now what's going to happen across the region?
Yeah, well, this is one of the blueprint that the Americans have done. The Middle East was initially set up by the British, and they created states, survivable states friendly to us. The Americans have not. They don't know this technique. All what they have done, they have demolished everything. So you end up with, even when you look at outside, if you look at Afghanistan, if you look at Libya, you can destroy the thing. And then after that, you just, Maliki, he has no control over the northern part of Iraq, which is the Kurdish area. He's now almost lost the control over the 1/3 of the western part of Iraq. He has problems in the south. He has problem in Baghdad itself. You cannot have the capital every day, 30 people dying there. This is not a government. So the situation there, it's really, this is the creation, how the Americans have created the thing. At the end of the day, and this is what makes the real ugly American in the eyes of the people in that region, because they created the thing, the uprising against Saddam Hussein, the Americans told the people to go, and then they left them alone. The Syrians, they've done the same thing. With the Libyans, they've done the same thing. With Afghanistan. So the whole exercise, that makes people, this is the cause of the future terrorism, unfortunately.
So do you think that there can be an alternative? Can any government which is maintaining the territorial integrity of Iraq emerge from this? Or do you think it's that's a lost cause?
I do believe that what is desperately needed is reconciliation. It has to be worked out. All the parties has to be brought on board. What have triggered previously when Iraq is one state under the leadership of Saddam Hussein, he has used brutal, ruthless crackdown against the Shias in order to quiet them down. That's why when they had the opportunity, at the first opportunity, they rose up against him. Now the Kurds are still part and parcel of Iraq, although we know that they have their own army and they have their own, they're moving towards an independent economy, but they're refusing to leave Iraq because of the 17% of the Iraqi budget, which is cut from Iraq and given to those areas. I do believe that what is really seriously pushing some of the politicians in the Anbar province is to have something like Kurdistan. That is, Iraqi government giving them part of the budget, a percentage of the budget, and leaving them to form their own foreign policy, their own army. And I think they have been encouraged by the Saudis. I mean, when I said the arming, the funding, and the logistical support to the Syrian insurgents, all went from Saudi Arabia in order to destabilize the government and topple it. And that would basically create the same sort of problem in Iraq, where the focus was initially on Iraq. I mean, those suicide bombings that were taking place, they actually started happening in 2012, not 2011. They're meant to start in 2011 after the Americans leave. But because the al-Qaida was busy in Syria, and it was, in a way, have been lured into Syria with all promises of funding, logistical support in Syria, that's why we didn't see any suicide bombings. They were taking place on a monthly basis, and that's why the strategy adopted by Saudi Arabia has changed into shifting and including Iraq as well.
A little bit about that, because do you think that the sort of erosion of American capacity in the Middle East is now opening up a space where Iran and Saudi Arabia and the regional powers are going to be able to shape the region?
Yes, but not in any tidy, consensual way. American power is clearly waning. They're moving away. They're signalling that in all sorts of ways. But what's happening then is that the proxy war between Saudi, and it's strange Saudi has only just been mentioned in this conversation, and Iran, is becoming one of the crucial dynamics. And that's a very ugly and destabilizing phenomenon, because it means the proxies that they support, and there are sort of Shia terrorist groups in Iraq as well who also do car bombings and murders and abductions. So the proxy actors supported by both sides have no natural sense of limits. They will go on killing without proportion, and they have no political boundaries in which they can see themselves stopping, except projects of total sectarian control.
Why do you think that is? Why is it that there's a kind of that the major powers seem to have some limit, but this isn't? What should just elaborate that point?
Because the major powers are acting like states do, with selfish motivations, but as a sense of danger and not going too far, not being dragged into open confrontation and state-to-state conflict. And then, whereas their proxies are driven by absolutely murderously convinced religious ideologies.
Do you think that's true?
I think there is another element into that one. The Western power of the U.S. The U.S. is a central government and wants to play the whole region in the way it wants to do. So it wants to create regional powers, but they have to be within a limit. That's why they dumped the Shah. That's why they got the Saudis and up and down, and the Iranians and what have you. So when you have the U.S. has a blueprint for the region. When that blueprint goes away, you end up with people each one of them has a different blueprint. The Saudis have their own...
but without the absolute capacity to impose it.
Without the capacity to... And at the end of the day, when the Americans were there, although they've used people to do things for them, but they had their own people, they had their own power. There was 250,000 soldiers in 91, then you had after 2003, etc., etc. But while the regional ones, they will just buy people, and and because of the need of the individual, one has to understand this, how they need.
Okay, well, just let me get a comment from Collin on this. I mean, how do you read this, Collin? Do you think that this is, you know, the suggestion here, I think, in the studio is that there's a kind of uncontrolled dynamic that runs when the regional powers are engaged that wasn't there before?
Well, it's certainly interesting to hear what one of your contributors was saying about the threat of militias and the role of militias in this being the kind of loose cannon, as it were. Only today we read that the League of the Righteous, which is one of the main Shia militia groups in Iran, in Iraq, but Iran sponsored, their leader Qais al-Khazali was reportedly issuing threats directly to Saudi Arabia, saying to them to stop interfering in the events in Anbar. So there is definitely a concern about that. And I can't remember whether he was actually threatening attacks, but he's certainly capable of doing that sort of thing.
Zaid, so last word, we're coming towards the end of the programme. Do you think there is now an uncontrollable dynamic running?
I think there is certainly the risk of that things moving in their own way, or just the situation dramatically deteriorating. But I do believe that the government now in Iraq is very wary, very careful. It doesn't want to have a massacre on its hand, and is trying to drive a wedge. And I think it's succeeded in Ramadi in doing that between the tribal leaders and al-Qaida supporters. The situation in Fallujah is different because there are some tribal leaders who are actually on the side of al-Qaida, and we've seen that the calls and the demands by the Sunni leaders all along for the army to be withdrawn for Anbar, this has spectacularly failed and spectacularly backfired, because the police and the local tribesmen who have actually cried out for help and support from the government because they couldn't take on the al-Qaida on their by themselves.
Stop you right there, because that's the end of the programme. Thanks for watching. My thanks to my studio guests and to Collin Freeman, who joined us on Skype. Do follow us in future editions of Analysis.